Lamar Chris Curry. I'm the pastor at Jackson and Ethel United Methodist Churches. The first memory I have of Methodism is from a hospital room. I had red measles and pneumonia, and I was in the hospital in Ruston, and I woke up to see a man whom I recognized standing there by my bed, and he had a black suit, white shirt, thin black tie, and he had a smile on his face, and he said, "Hi, I'm Pastor Henry Blunt, and I came to see you and to say a prayer for you." And he said a prayer for me, and I remembered that all my life. And of course, I didn't sense a call to preach at that moment, but that began my sensitivity to the things of God and to the Spirit leading me in the grace of God, that prevenient grace that goes before. And as the years went by, I was nurtured in the Grace Methodist Church, which became the Grace United Methodist Church in 1968. And I had some wonderful pastors who were there before I even knew it with my family. My father was a steward, trustee, now we're called, in that church, and he was a professor at Louisiana Tech. And so that church meant a lot to me in the nurturing years. As a teenager, I got off playing the piano with singing groups, and started going to a little church in Texas after my father died. He died when I was 9, and we moved away. And I started going to a little church in Texas playing the piano on Wednesday nights. And I was taking piano lessons from an Alabama Coshada Indian, or Native American. And he was teaching me how to play out of the hymn book. So they had to sing what I could play. And so that was part of the calling. I began to sense a calling to do something in the church, and I played the piano on Wednesday nights. And they said, "Please learn another one so we can sing another song next Wednesday." And then I cut the grass for the church, and I felt like I needed to be doing something for the church. Maybe because I knew my father was doing it, but on a higher level because God was leading me. And I started sensing God tugging at me as I got older. And then I started really sensing that even though I was playing the piano with singing groups as a teenager, that God was calling me to preach. And one elderly preacher about my age now, he told me, he said, "Son, if you can do anything but preach, do it. And then if you can't, you'll know that it's God calling you." Well, I don't know if that's the best advice to give to someone, but I remembered that all through the years as well. And I couldn't do anything else, at least a large part of my life. Then I found myself sensing that call more and more, and moved into it, and actually was ordained in another denomination. I was in there for 10 years and couldn't help but come back to the Methodist, and had a lot of encouragement, and spent 10 years in another denomination, and 40 years, close to 40 years in the Methodist, a total of about 50 years of ordained ministry. But 25 of those years I was in education, and taught New Testament for LSU for 7 years full-time. And so the ordained ministry took on a different shape for me, and I'm thankful that the conference was big enough to recognize that God was using me in different ways, and I was in some good churches. I have a couple of stories. One is somewhat humorous. Maybe I'll tell you two quick humorous ones, and then one a little more serious. One is I was associate at First Church in Bossier City, and we were growing by leaps and bounds, and I had probably a couple of dozen people in a stack of cards to visit for membership almost every week. And so one Sunday, among many of these type Sundays, I was asked to bring the children's sermon. And so I decided I would find something that week for the children's sermon, and there was no internet, keep in mind, in that day. We're talking in the 80s. And so I found an article about a man who was taking scrap iron and building beautiful sculptures from scrap iron. And I said, with a preacher's heart looking at that, I said, there's a sermon in there, and there's a children's sermon in there. So I got an old hubcap, and we had about probably 200 to 300 people there for the worship service, and I walked out there with about 12 or 15 children ready for the children's sermon. And as I walked out there, one of the officers from the Air Force Base in Barksdale, his child, and the parents were sitting proudly a couple of rows from the front, and the child screamed out when he saw the hubcap, "Where did you steal that?" And so the mother was trying to crawl underneath the pew, and the father was dying laughing. He didn't care. And the congregation was falling all over itself laughing. This is a little more formal time than we have now, keep in mind. We're talking about decades ago. And that's back when the ministers all wore suits to annual conference, if you can imagine that. And every meeting at annual conference wearing a suit and tie. And the other one was quickly another children's sermon at First United Methodist in Baton Rouge. When I was associate there, we had 4 or 5 elders there at Baton Rouge at the First Church. 4 or 5 elders in different areas of responsibility, and I was in education and children's ministry, and I went out there with a fishing pole, fishers of men, fishers of people, and so I was getting ready. Keep in mind, we're talking the late 80s there in First Church. So in the late 80s, I went out there for the children's sermon at First Church with, again, about 300 people or so present, as I walked out, a certain minister in town had been in the news a lot of the time during that time. Some of you will remember it was quite a story in the national news as well. And when I walked out, the little boy screamed out, look, Mommy, it's Jimmy Swaggart." And so another meltdown of the congregation laughing, and that's about as far as that service got that day. Those are 2 of the humorous ones. One that I can tell you that touches my heart. I went to camp at Caney Lake when I was a child. And when you get my age, you go back and look at your childhood experiences. So that's why it's so easy for any preacher to just go on forever about things that happened in their childhood. And this is an important one. I went to summer camp. W.O. Lynch was the camp director, and some of you will remember some of these names. W.O. Lynch was very dedicated, and all these years, and I'm still looking for the photograph that we took. I know I've got it somewhere of the whole camp, everybody there. But W.O. Lynch saw to it that we heard the message of Jesus Christ, and that He could come to us, and He could help us to know who Jesus is, and that we could be saved. And I had been baptized, of course, and I had been nurtured, of course, and I was a small child, but I sensed the moving of the Spirit for the first time in my life. I could sense the Holy Spirit and that prevenient grace and that justifying grace coming to me, and the sanctifying. How do we separate it all anyway? And coming and grabbing me, and it stayed with me all my life. And there was a song that we sang, and I'm not going to try to sing it. I'm not really a singer. I'm just an old quartet piano player. And the song said, "For God so loved the world, He gave His only Son to die on Calvary from sin to set me free. One day He's coming back. What glory that will be. Wonderful His love for me." And that song just stayed in my heart all my life. And there have been many, many times that it's come back to me in different kinds of situations, situations of sorrow, situations of joy, situations in the ministry. And I thank God for that grace that comes alive through the Holy Spirit in our lives. And that was one of the most important events in my life, and I didn't even realize it at the time. It took decades for me to realize what that meant. And it's what led me to the call. It's what led me to want to preach and help people and minister to people and follow Jesus Christ and be a disciple and all those good things that we teach in Methodism. I'm sure I'll leave somebody out, but I'm thankful for my wife, Corrada. She's been so supportive, so understanding, my best friend, and we've been married 40 years, and it's been wonderful, 40 wonderful years. I'm thankful for her support. And in the church, I'm thankful for all the ministers, the ones that came when I didn't know they were there, like Doug McGuire, and of course Henry Blunt, whom I've told you about in my life, and Henry Blunt. George Ross, I think, is the one who preached my father's funeral at Grace Church in Ruston. James Adams, John Lee at Bossier First Church in the 80s, and Joe McLean at First Church in Baton Rouge. I was associate for them, and I thank God that they put up with me, because I wasn't exactly the theological persuasion that they thought I was, but they embraced me and encouraged me anyway, and that was great. It was wonderful. And all the others along the way, there have been so many who have helped. And I was in, as I said, 25 years in university administration, and 15 of that we were in Italy. And when we came back 10 years ago, I met with Van Stinson, and he found a place for me back in the conference when almost no one knew me. I stayed in the connection all those years, and somehow I was allowed to stay connected, and I thank God for that. And because the connection recognized that I was either in the ministry or on the edge of it, and I was dean of students over there in Italy, which was a lot like being a minister without doing the sacraments a lot of the time. And so all the people to whom I reported at least annually during those years, it was great that they received my reports and many times responded, and it was positive. And thankful that Van Stinson helped me get back in the conference. Not that I wasn't already in it. I remained an elder all those years. And just thank God for the ministry opportunities. I've pastored in Slaughter the first year, getting reoriented back in the States and in the conference after many years away. And then I've been in Jackson and Ethel churches. This is my 8th year, and they're still putting up with me there, and I hope to stay past retirement. We'll see what happens, and whatever the Lord wants and the conference wants and the connection wants, that's what I want. And all the wonderful congregations, all the laity, all their support, their prayers, their financial support. I often said, I'm getting paid to do what I would want to do anyway if I had the money. And so thanks be to God for that prevenient grace, for that justifying grace, and that sanctifying grace that so much bigger than we could ever imagine, so much greater than we could ever fathom. It's all made possible by the Spirit moving within us, through us, and in the church.